Hello and welcome back to Soft History Stories. Tonight, we travel to a cold spring night in 1775, where a few hundred farmers gathered on a village green in Massachusetts. They held muskets they barely knew how to use, waiting for an army that had crossed an ocean to keep them in line. Most expected to be home before breakfast. None realized they were standing at the edge of something vast, the slow, unfolding beginning of a war that would create an entirely new kind of nation, one built not around a throne, but around a radical idea about how people should govern themselves. But here's the question that should make you pause. What turns loyal subjects into rebels? What makes ordinary people willing to risk everything, their lives, their families, their futures, for an idea? Before we begin, take a slow, deliberate breath. If you find comfort in these quiet journeys through history, you might gently tap like and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what we create here. And if you're moved to share, leave your location and local time in the comments. It helps other restless souls and sleepless travelers find their way to this little corner of the internet. Know that someone else is awake out there too. Now, settle in. Let your shoulders drop. Let the day slip quietly behind you, and let yourself drift slowly into the long, remarkable story of the American Revolution. To understand how it all started, we have to step back from the gunfire and look at the world as it actually was, because nothing about this revolution was inevitable. North America did not think of themselves as Americans. They thought of themselves as British. They drank British tea, read British newspapers weeks after the news was already stale, wore clothes cut to British fashion, and prayed in churches whose forms had crossed the sea with their grandparents. When they spoke of home, many of them still meant England, a place most had never seen and never would. These colonists were proud of being British, and that pride is the thing modern listeners most often forget. They believed they held the rights of free Englishmen, rights won slowly and painfully over centuries of struggle between English kings and English subjects. Chief among those rights was a simple idea that had hardened into something close to sacred. A free man could not be taxed without the consent of his own elected representatives. In England, those representatives sat in Parliament. In the colonies, they sat in local assemblies, in places like the Virginia House of Burgesses and the Massachusetts General Court. For most of the century, London had been content to let those local assemblies handle local money, and the arrangement had worked well enough that almost no one questioned it. There was a comfortable distance built into the whole system, and the distance was not only emotional, it was physical. A letter sent from London might take 6 to 8 weeks to reach Boston. If the weather cooperated and the ship did not sink, an order from the king's ministers could be a season old by the time a colonial governor unfolded it. That lag had quietly allowed the colonies to govern much of their own affairs out of sheer practical necessity. When a decision had to be made, and the nearest authority who could approve it was 2 months away by sail, people learned to decide things themselves. Over many decades, that habit of deciding things became a kind of independence that nobody had declared and nobody quite noticed. The colonies themselves were not one place, but 13 separate worlds, each with its own character, its own economy, and its own quiet sense of superiority over the others. A Boston merchant and a South Carolina planter had about as much in common as a Scotsman and a Spaniard, which is to say they shared a language, a king, and a deep suspicion of one another's manners. They squabbled over boundaries, over trade, over religion, and over who owed whom money. The notion that these 13 rival colonies might one day stand together as a single nation would have struck almost anyone in 1760 as a fantasy, and a faintly ridiculous one at that. Yet something was shifting underneath the surface. Slowly, the way a riverbank erodes long before it collapses. The population was growing at a pace that astonished European observers. Families were large, Land was relatively cheap by the standards of crowded Europe, and people lived a little longer and ate a little better than their cousins across the sea. A young man in the colonies could reasonably expect to own land of his own, and a man who owns land tends to develop opinions about who has the right to reach into his pockets. This was a society of small property holders, restless and ambitious, and it was breeding a quiet confidence that would not stay quiet forever. The land itself shaped them. To the west lay a frontier that seemed to go on without limit, a vast interior of forest and river that promised opportunity to the bold and danger to the careless. The colonists pressed against that frontier constantly, hungry for new ground, and that hunger would soon collide with the interests of the native nations who already lived there, and with the policies of a faraway government that had its own ideas about where settlement should stop. Every one of these pressures, the pride, the distance, the growth, the land hunger, was building toward a reckoning. None of them alone would have been enough. Together, slowly, they were laying the kindling. And so we arrive at that cold green in Massachusetts, where a handful of farmers waited in the dark. They were not yet rebels. Most of them still hoped the trouble would pass, that London would see reason, that the comfortable old arrangement would hold. They were ordinary people standing at the threshold of an extraordinary thing. And, like most people at most thresholds, they had no idea what lay on the other side. To understand why they were standing there at all, we have to go further back still, to the colonies as they lived and breathed before any shot was fired, before the word independence had crossed many lips. We have to walk through that vanished world first, gently, and see it whole. Picture the eastern seaboard of North America in the middle of the 1760s, stretched thin along the Atlantic like a long ribbon of settlement clinging to the coast. Behind it rose the dark wall of the Appalachian Mountains, and beyond those mountains lay a continent that Europeans had barely begun to imagine. The colonies were a coastal people, their lives organized around harbors and rivers, their faces turned toward the sea that connected them to the wider world. Almost everything that mattered, trade, news, fashion, authority, arrived by ship. In the north sat New England, a cluster of colonies with a sharp and particular flavor. Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and New Hampshire had been settled in large part by Puritans, and even generations later, their society carried the marks of that founding. New Englanders valued education to an unusual degree. They built schools and a college early. They argued about theology the way other people argued about weather, and they governed themselves through town meetings where ordinary men stood up and spoke their minds. This was a region of small farms, fishing fleets, shipbuilders, and merchants. A place where the soil was stony and the winters were long, which perhaps explains why its people developed a reputation for thrift, stubbornness, and a certain talent for moral certainty. Boston was their great city, though by the standards of London it was barely a town, with something like 15,000 people. Still, Boston crackled with energy. Its wharves bristled with masts, its taverns hummed with talk, and its merchants had grown wealthy moving goods around the Atlantic, sometimes within the rules of British trade law, and sometimes with a wink around them. Smuggling was practically a respectable profession in Boston, which is worth remembering because when London later tried to enforce its trade laws strictly, it was not merely interfering with abstract principles. It was reaching directly into the bank accounts of some very determined men. To the south of New England lay the Middle Colonies, and here the picture changed. New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware were a patchwork of peoples, far more mixed than tidy New England. Here lived Dutch families whose ancestors had settled New York when it was still called New Amsterdam. German farmers in the Pennsylvania countryside, Scots-Irish settlers pushing toward the frontier, Quakers, Catholics, Jews, and a dozen other groups who had come seeking land or refuge, or simply the freedom to be left alone. Philadelphia in Pennsylvania was the largest and most sophisticated city in all the colonies, a place of broad streets and brick houses, of printers and scientists and busy commerce. It was in many ways the most modern city in British America, and it would soon become the stage on which the colonies learned to speak as one. Further south still lay a different world again. The southern colonies of Maryland, Virginia, the Carolinas, and Georgia. This was a land of warm climate and long growing seasons, of great plantations spreading along the rivers, and its economy rested on the cultivation of cash crops, tobacco above all, and rice and indigo further south. It also rested, brutally, on the labor of enslaved people. Slavery existed in every one of the 13 colonies, but in the South, it had become the foundation of the entire economic order. The wealth of the great planter families, families like the Washingtons and the Lees and the Randolphs of Virginia, was built on the forced labor of human beings they owned. This is the deep and bitter contradiction sitting at the heart of the story we are telling. The very men who would soon write some of the most stirring words ever composed about liberty and the rights of all people were many of them holding other people in bondage even as they wrote. We will not look away from that. It is part of the truth, and the truth is what we are here for. Across these 3 regions, life had a texture that would feel both familiar and strange to us now. The overwhelming majority of colonists lived on farms and worked the land. Their days were ruled by sunlight and season, by planting and harvest, by the endless labor of feeding a family from the ground up. Most people never traveled more than a few dozen miles from where they were born. Their world was their village, their county, their parish, and the news of the wider world reached them slowly, passed along by travelers, by peddlers, and by the precious printed sheets of the colonial newspapers. Those newspapers matter more than they might seem. The colonies had a remarkably literate population by the standards of the age, especially in New England, and printed words traveled. A pamphlet written in Boston could be reprinted in Philadelphia and read aloud in a tavern in Charleston within a few weeks. Ideas could move. And the men who controlled the presses, the printers and editors and pamphleteers, would prove to be among the most dangerous weapons the colonies possessed, more dangerous in the long run than muskets. Knitting all of this loosely together was the framework of British rule. Each colony had a governor, usually appointed by the king, and each had an elected assembly of local property holders. The governors held formal power, but the assemblies held the purse, and over the years, the assemblies had learned to use that power to extract concessions, much as Parliament in England had once wrung concessions from English monarchs. It was a system full of friction, but the friction was familiar, and it had a kind of rough stability. Nobody, or almost nobody, wanted to overturn it. The colonists were not looking for a revolution. They wanted, if anything, to be left to manage their own affairs in peace, as they had grown accustomed to doing. The trouble, when it came, would come not because the colonists demanded something new, but because London decided to take something away. And the reason London decided to do that brings us to a war that was already over, a war fought not in the colonies' name, but very much on their soil. A war that had drained the British treasury dry. For most of the 1750s and into the early 1760s, the colonies were caught up in a conflict far larger than themselves. In North America, they called it the French and Indian War. In Europe, where it sprawled across continents and oceans, it was part of what later historians named the 7 Years' War, a struggle so vast that some have called it the first true World War. At its heart lay a contest between 2 great powers, Britain and France, for control of trade, territory, and influence across the globe. And one of the prizes they fought over was the interior of North America. The trouble had begun in the wild country of the Ohio Valley, that contested ground beyond the mountains, where British colonial ambitions ran headlong into French claims. Both empires wanted the land, and so did the native nations who actually lived there, and who shrewdly played the two powers against each other for as long as they could. A young Virginia officer named George Washington, then in his early 20s, had been sent into that wilderness on a mission that helped spark the wider war. His early efforts there ended in clumsy failure and surrender, a detail worth holding on to, because the man who fumbled his first command in the Ohio woods would one day be asked to win independence for a nation, and he would carry the lessons of those early humiliations with him for the rest of his life. The war went badly for Britain at first. French forces and their native allies inflicted sharp defeats on British and colonial armies, and there were years when the cause looked grim. But Britain had deeper pockets and a more powerful navy, and under determined leadership in London, the tide began to turn. British forces captured the great fortress city of Quebec in 1759 in a battle fought on the heights above the St. Lawrence River, and with that victory, the French hold on North America began to crumble. By the time the war formally ended in 1763, France had been driven almost entirely off the continent. Britain now controlled an empire in North America of staggering size, stretching from the frozen north down through the 13 colonies and west to the Mississippi. It was a tremendous victory, and the colonists celebrated it as their own. They had fought and bled in that war alongside British regulars. They were proud subjects of a triumphant empire, and in the glow of victory, the bond between the colonies and the mother country had perhaps never seemed stronger. If you had stood in Boston or Philadelphia in 1763 and predicted that within little more than a decade these same people would be shooting at British soldiers, you would have been laughed out of the room. Price was money. Wars are expensive, and this one had been enormously so. Britain emerged triumphant and very nearly bankrupt, its national debt swollen to a size that alarmed its ministers and frightened its taxpayers. The British people at home were already among the most heavily taxed in Europe, and they were in no mood to pay still more. And here the ministers in London made a calculation that seemed perfectly reasonable from where they sat, and which would prove to be one of the most costly miscalculations in the history of empire. The war, they reasoned, had been fought in large part to defend the American colonies and to win them new land. The colonists had benefited enormously. Surely then it was only fair that the colonists should help pay for it. And on top of the old debt, Britain now had to garrison and defend its vast new territories, which meant keeping a standing army in North America, which cost still more money every single year. The logic in London ran in a straight and confident line. The colonies should contribute to their own defense. The simplest way to make them contribute was to tax them. And so London resolved to do exactly that. The flaw in this tidy reasoning was not the arithmetic. The flaw was that the men making the decision had almost no understanding of the people they were deciding for. They imagined the colonists as grateful provincials who would naturally accept their share of the burden. They did not grasp how deeply the colonists held to that old principle about taxation and consent. They did not understand that to a New England farmer or a Virginia planter, a tax laid by a parliament in which he had no voice was not a fair share of a common burden. It was an assault on the most basic right of a free Englishman. It tells you a great deal about how little time the gentleman in London had ever spent in an American tavern, where this principle was discussed with the heat and confidence that other men reserve for religion. There was also the matter of the Western land, and here London managed to offend the colonists almost immediately. To keep peace with the native nations of the interior and to avoid the expense of constant frontier wars, the British government issued a proclamation in 1763 forbidding colonial settlement beyond the crest of the Appalachian Mountains. From the perspective of London, this was prudent policy. From the perspective of land-hungry colonists who had just helped win that very wilderness with their own blood, it was an outrage. The land they had fought for was now declared off-limits to them by a distant authority that had never set foot in it. Speculators who had invested fortunes in Western land, men like Washington among them, found their schemes blocked by the stroke of a royal pen. So the years just after the great victory, which should have been a golden age of imperial harmony, instead planted the first seeds of resentment. The colonists felt their loyalty had earned them respect and reward. Instead, they got new taxes and new restrictions designed by men who did not know them and did not consult them. The mood in the colonies began, very subtly, to sour. It was not yet anger. It was something quieter and more dangerous, the slow dawning sense of being treated not as partners, but as subordinates. Not as Englishmen, but as something less. And into this souring mood, in the year 1765, London introduced the measure that would turn quiet resentment into open defiance. The measure was called the Stamp Act, and on paper it looked almost harmless. Beginning in 1765, Parliament decreed that a wide range of printed materials in the colonies would have to be produced on specially stamped paper that had been taxed and bore an official mark proving the tax had been paid. Newspapers, legal documents, contracts, licenses, even playing cards and dice would require the stamp. It was a small tax, really, a few pennies here and there, and the revenue it raised was meant to help pay for the soldiers stationed in America. The ministers who designed it expected grumbling, perhaps, but compliance. What they got instead was an explosion. The Stamp Act touched a nerve that the ministers had not understood was there, and it touched it across every colony at once. For the first time, taxes had been laid not on trade, which colonists had grudgingly accepted as Parliament's traditional business, but directly on the internal affairs of the colonies, on the very documents and newspapers and transactions of daily life. This was, the colonists argued, a tax in the purest and most alarming sense. A tax laid upon them by a body in which they had no representative, no voice, no vote. And they reached back to that old deep principle and made it a battle cry: no taxation without representation. The reaction was swift and it was clever. In the assemblies, colonial leaders passed resolutions denouncing the act and asserting their rights. In Virginia, a young and fiery lawyer named Patrick Henry rose in the House of Burgesses and delivered speeches so bold that some of the older members muttered the word treason. But the resistance went far beyond the polite chambers of the assemblies. It poured out into the streets. In Boston and other towns, a network of organized opposition sprang up, calling themselves the Sons of Liberty. These were not aristocrats. They were merchants, artisans, printers, tavern keepers, dock workers, men of the middling and working sort, and they understood something the gentlemen in London never grasped, which was the power of crowds, theatre, and intimidation. When the men appointed to distribute the stamped paper arrived to take up their posts, the Sons of Liberty made their lives unbearable. They hung effigies of the stamp distributors from trees, paraded them through the streets, and sometimes attacked their homes. One by one, the stamp distributors resigned their commissions in fear, often quite publicly, until there was almost no one left willing to enforce the act. A tax that cannot be collected is not really a tax. It is just an insult on paper. The colonists added economic pressure to the street pressure. Merchants up and down the coast agreed to stop importing British goods until the act was repealed. These non-importation agreements struck directly at British manufacturers and merchants, who suddenly found their American market drying up. And here the colonists discovered a weapon they would use again and again in the years to come. They could not vote in Parliament, but they could refuse to buy. And in refusing to buy, they could make their displeasure felt in the one place London truly cared about, which was the ledger. There was also a meeting that, in hindsight, mattered enormously. In the autumn of 1765, delegates from 9 of the colonies gathered in New York for what became known as the Stamp Act Congress. It was the first time representatives from a broad range of colonies had come together to coordinate a response to a common grievance. They were still nervous about it, still careful to profess their loyalty to the king, and they accomplished little of formal substance. But the precedent was set. The colonies had begun, however hesitantly, to act together. They had taken a first small step away from being 13 separate worlds and toward being something that could speak with one voice. Nobody at that Congress was planning a revolution. They were simply trying to get a tax repealed. But they were building the habit of cooperation, and habits once formed are hard to break. The pressure worked. The non-importation agreements bit deep. British merchants howled. And in 1766, Parliament repealed the Stamp Act. The colonies erupted in celebration. There were bonfires and toasts and grateful addresses to the king. For a moment it seemed the storm had passed, that the comfortable old order had been restored, that loyalty and reason had won the day. But the celebration was built on a misunderstanding, because tucked alongside the repeal, Parliament had quietly passed another law, the Declaratory Act, which asserted in cold and absolute language that Parliament had the right to make laws binding the colonies in all cases whatsoever. London had backed down on the specific tax, but it had refused to surrender the principle. The fundamental disagreement remained, unresolved, waiting. And it did not wait long. Within a year, a new chancellor in London, a clever and reckless man named Charles Townshend, devised a fresh scheme to raise revenue from the colonies. The Townshend duties, as they came to be called, placed taxes on a range of goods imported into the colonies. Things like glass, paper, paint, lead, and tea. Townshend believed he had found a path around the colonial objection because these were duties on trade, the kind of tax colonists had traditionally accepted, rather than a direct internal tax like the stamp. He was wrong. The colonists had moved past such fine distinctions. A tax meant to raise revenue from them without their consent was a tax they would resist, whatever clever name it was given. So the cycle began again, but harder this time, and with less goodwill on either side. New non-importation agreements spread. The Sons of Liberty grew more organized and more confident. Colonial writers produced a flood of pamphlets and essays arguing the colonial case with increasing sophistication and increasing boldness. And London, growing impatient with what it saw as colonial ingratitude and lawlessness, made a fateful decision. It would send troops to Boston, the most defiant of all the colonial towns, to restore order and to back up the authority of the Crown. Soldiers in red coats began to march through the streets of a city that did not want them, lodging among a population that resented their presence, their muskets, and the very sight of them. It was a recipe for trouble, and trouble was not long in coming. On a cold evening in the early spring of 1770, it arrived. By the winter of 1770, Boston had become a tense and unhappy place. For more than a year, British soldiers had been quartered in the town, and the friction between the redcoats and the townspeople had ground steadily worse with each passing month. To the people of Boston, the soldiers were an occupying army, a standing force sent to intimidate them in their own streets. To the soldiers, Boston was a hostile and ungrateful posting, full of sullen civilians who insulted them, taunted them, and occasionally pelted them with whatever came to hand. The two groups lived crowded together in a small town, rubbing against each other daily, and the resentment built like pressure behind a dam. There was an economic edge to the hostility as well, a detail that often gets lost beneath the grander story. British soldiers were poorly paid, and many of them took part-time work in Boston during their off hours to make ends meet. This meant they competed with local laborers for scarce jobs, and they were often willing to work for less. So the working men of Boston had a very ordinary, very human reason to dislike the soldiers. Quite apart from any high principle about liberty, they were taking the bread off local tables. Revolutions are made of grand ideas, but they are also made of small grievances like this one, and it is the small grievances that often light the match. On the evening of the March 5th, 1770, the small grievances and the grand ones collided. It began, as these things often do, with something almost trivial. A young apprentice exchanged angry words with a British sentry standing guard outside the custom house on King Street. The argument escalated. The sentry struck the youth, and a crowd began to gather in the cold and the snow. The crowd grew, and it grew angry. People shouted insults at the lone sentry, threw snowballs and chunks of ice and pressed closer. The sentry, frightened, called for help. A small squad of soldiers came to his aid, led by an officer, and now there were several redcoats standing with their backs to the custom house, facing a swelling, jeering mob in the dark. The situation was as dangerous as a situation can be. The soldiers were outnumbered and afraid. The crowd was furious and emboldened. People dared the soldiers to fire, screaming at them, hurling objects, surging forward and falling back. The officer tried to keep control, and then, in the chaos and confusion, with shouting on every side, a soldier fired. Others fired after him. The muskets flashed in the dark, and when the smoke cleared, several Bostonians lay dead or dying in the bloody snow of King Street. 5 colonists died from the wounds they took that night. Among the first to fall was a man named Crispus Attucks, a dock worker of African and Native American descent, who would later be remembered as one of the first to die in the cause of American liberty. The dead were ordinary men, and their deaths transformed the political quarrel into something visceral and personal. Blood had been spilled. British soldiers had killed British subjects in the streets of an American town. The event needed only a name, and the patriot leaders of Boston gave it one calculated to inflame: the Boston Massacre. Here we meet the genius of the colonial resistance, which understood that the battle was not only in the streets, but in the mind, and that the way an event is remembered matters as much as the event itself. A silversmith and engraver named Paul Revere produced a vivid print of the scene, showing a tidy line of British soldiers firing in cold blood upon a defenseless crowd of innocent townspeople. It was, as a piece of journalism, deeply misleading. The reality of that night had been a confused and terrifying scramble, not an orderly execution. But as a piece of propaganda, it was magnificent. The image spread through the colonies and seared itself into the public imagination. The Boston Massacre became a symbol, proof of what the colonists had feared all along, that the British government was prepared to murder them to enforce its will. And yet, in one of the most surprising and admirable turns of the whole affair, the soldiers who fired that night were given a fair trial. The man who stepped forward to defend them in court was none other than John Adams, a Boston lawyer and a committed patriot, a cousin of the fiery agitator Samuel Adams, and a future leader of the Revolution himself. Adams believed deeply that even hated men deserved a proper defense, and that the rule of law was precisely the thing the colonists claimed to be fighting for. To abandon it when it became inconvenient would be to betray the cause itself. So Adams defended the soldiers, argued that they had fired in genuine fear for their lives, and won acquittal for them. It was an act of considerable personal courage, and it revealed something important about the better instincts at work within the revolutionary movement, a commitment to law and fairness that would at its best shape the nation to come. In the immediate aftermath, the temperature actually cooled for a while. By a strange coincidence, on the very same day as the killings on King Street, Parliament in London had moved to repeal most of the hated Townshend duties, bowing once again to the economic pressure of colonial boycotts. Only one duty was kept, the tax on tea, retained not because it raised much money, but because the government wished to preserve the principle that it had the right to tax the colonies at all. With the rest of the duties gone, much of the heat went out of the conflict. Trade resumed. The boycott faded. For 2 or 3 years, an uneasy quiet settled over the colonies, and many on both sides hoped the worst was finally behind them. But the quiet was deceptive. The underlying disagreement had never been resolved. The tax on tea still stood, a small but constant reminder of the principle the colonists rejected, and London refused to abandon. The memory of the men who had died on King Street did not fade. The Sons of Liberty kept their networks alive, kept writing, kept watching. Beneath the calm surface, the two sides remained exactly as far apart as ever. It would take only a single new provocation to shatter the peace. And in 1773, over that very tax on tea, the provocation came. The crisis that broke the uneasy peace grew out of something that should have made tea cheaper, not more contentious, which tells you a good deal about how raw the colonial nerves had become. The trouble began with the British East India Company, an enormous trading corporation that had fallen into deep financial difficulty. The company was sitting on vast quantities of unsold tea, and the British government, which had a strong interest in the company's survival, devised a plan to help it. Parliament passed the Tea Act in 1773, which allowed the East India Company to ship its tea directly to the colonies and sell it through selected agents, cutting out the middlemen. The effect of this was that the company's tea, even with the small tax still attached, would actually be cheaper than the smuggled Dutch tea that many colonists had been drinking for years. On its face, this looked like a gift to the American consumer. Cheaper tea, who could object to that? But the colonial leaders saw the trap, and it was a real one. If the colonists bought the cheap tax tea, they would be accepting with every purchase the principle that Parliament had the right to tax them. London had wrapped the hated principle inside a bargain, hoping that colonial thrift would overcome colonial principle. It was a clever bet, and it badly underestimated the people it was aimed at. There was a more practical anger underneath the principle as well. The arrangement also threatened to ruin the colonial merchants who had built their businesses on importing tea, including the smugglers, who were often the very same respectable men who led the resistance. So principle and self-interest pointed in the same direction, which is the most dangerous combination in politics. The colonists resolved that the East India Company's tea would not be sold. In most ports, the pressure of the Sons of Liberty was enough. Ships carrying the tea were turned away, or their cargoes were locked in warehouses and left to rot, or the consignees were intimidated into refusing the shipments. The tea simply could not be landed and sold. But in Boston, the standoff turned into a direct confrontation. The royal governor of Massachusetts, Thomas Hutchinson, was a stubborn and proud man, and he was determined that the law would be obeyed and the tea would be landed. Several ships loaded with East India Company tea sat in Boston Harbor, and the governor refused to let them leave without unloading their cargo and paying the tax. The Sons of Liberty, for their part, were equally determined that the tea would never touch the dock. A deadline loomed, set by law, after which the cargo could be seized and sold by the authorities, whether the colonists liked it or not. The two sides were locked, neither willing to give way. On the night of the December 16, 1773, the colonists broke the deadlock in a way no one in London had anticipated. A large body of men, some of them thinly disguised as Mohawk warriors with soot and paint on their faces, gathered near the harbor, marched to the wharf, and boarded the tea ships. Working efficiently and with surprising discipline, they hauled the chests of tea up from the holds, split them open, and dumped them into the dark water of the harbor. They worked for hours. By the time they were done, they had thrown the entire shipment, hundreds of chests, thousands of pounds of tea, into the sea. Then they swept the decks clean, put everything back in order, and went home. The whole operation was carried out without looting and without violence to any person, which was itself a kind of statement. This was not a riot. It was a deliberate, organized act of political destruction. The disguises fooled no one, of course, and were never really meant to. Everyone understood who had done it and why. The colonists called it, in time, the Boston Tea Party, a name with a certain dark wit to it, as though the harbor itself had been invited to take tea. It was the boldest act of defiance yet, a direct and theatrical destruction of valuable private property, and it forced the conflict to a new level. There could be no pretending now that this was merely a disagreement among loyal subjects. The colonists had destroyed the property of a British company in open defiance of British law, and London could not let such a thing pass. The British response was furious, and it was harsh, and in its harshness it accomplished exactly the opposite of what it intended. Parliament, led by a government determined to make an example of Massachusetts and to break the spirit of colonial resistance once and for all, passed a series of laws in 1774 that the colonists named with grim accuracy the Intolerable Acts. The port of Boston was closed entirely until the destroyed tea was paid for, a devastating blow to a town that lived by the sea. The Charter of Massachusetts was effectively suspended, stripping the colony of much of its cherished self-government and placing power in the hands of royally appointed officials. Town meetings, the very heart of New England political life, were sharply restricted. Royal officials accused of crimes could be sent to England for trial, beyond the reach of colonial juries, and a new law required colonists to provide quarters for British soldiers. London believed these measures would isolate Massachusetts, frighten the other colonies into obedience, and crush the troublemakers. The calculation was almost perfectly wrong. Instead of isolating Massachusetts, the Intolerable Acts united the colonies in sympathy and alarm, as nothing before had done. The other colonies looked at what had been done to Massachusetts, the closed port, the suspended government, the soldiers, and they understood that what could be done to one colony could be done to all. If London could simply revoke a colony's charter and shut its harbor at will, then no colony's rights were safe. The punishment of Boston became the common cause of all. Relief poured into the blockaded town from up and down the coast. Food and supplies and money sent by colonists who had never set foot in Massachusetts. And the leaders of the colonies began to feel that the time had come to gather, to consult, and to decide together what was to be done. The scattered resistance was about to become something organized and continental. In the late summer and early autumn of 1774, delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies made their way to Philadelphia. Only Georgia, the youngest and most exposed of the colonies, stayed away, and even Georgia was sympathetic. The men who gathered called their meeting the First Continental Congress, and although they did not know it, they were taking one of the most consequential steps in the whole story. For the first time, the colonies were not merely coordinating a boycott or protesting a single tax. They were assembling as a body to deliberate on the shared crisis of their relationship with the mother country, and to decide together how to respond. The men who came to Philadelphia were not revolutionaries, at least not most of them, and not yet. They were respectable men of property and standing, lawyers and merchants and planters, the leading figures of their colonies. They came with a wide range of views. Some were radicals like Samuel Adams of Massachusetts, who had quietly concluded that independence was both inevitable and desirable, though he was far too shrewd to say so openly. Others were moderates and conservatives who genuinely hoped to repair the breach with Britain and recover the old harmonious relationship, and who were frightened by the more extreme talk they heard around them. The Congress was a gathering of rivals as much as allies, men who eyed each other warily, suspicious of one another's ambitions and unsure whom to trust. And they faced an enormous practical problem before they could even begin, which was that they barely knew each other. These were leading men from 13 separate societies that had spent their entire histories looking across the Atlantic toward London, rather than across their own borders toward one another. A Massachusetts delegate and a South Carolina delegate had probably never met, had little in common in manners or temperament, and harbored real differences of interest and outlook. Much of the early work of the Congress was simply the work of these men learning to take one another's measure in the formal sessions and, just as importantly, over long dinners and longer evenings in the taverns and parlors of Philadelphia. A continental movement could not be built among strangers. It had to be built among men who had come to know and at least somewhat to trust one another. John Adams of Massachusetts, who kept a sharp and often unflattering diary of these proceedings, recorded his impressions of his fellow delegates with a lawyer's eye and a New Englander's readiness to judge. He found some of them brilliant and some of them tiresome, and he worried constantly that the Congress would talk and accomplish nothing. The Massachusetts men were in a delicate position. Their colony was the one under direct attack, the one with its port closed and its government suspended, and they desperately needed the support of the others. But they also knew that if they appeared too radical, too eager for confrontation, they would frighten the moderates and split the Congress before it could act. So the New England radicals played a careful game, holding back their true feelings, letting delegates from other colonies take the lead, building consensus slowly rather than forcing the pace. The Congress did real and significant work. It debated the rights of the colonies and produced a declaration of those rights, asserting once again the principles the colonists held dear: the right to life, liberty, and property, the right to be governed by their own assemblies, the right not to be taxed without consent. It rejected the intolerable acts as unconstitutional and void, and it took a step with real teeth, organizing a comprehensive boycott of British goods, far more thorough and better enforced than anything attempted before. This was the creation of the Continental Association, a network of local committees in towns and counties across the colonies, charged with enforcing the boycott, watching their neighbors, and punishing those who violated it. These committees were in effect a shadow government springing up alongside the official one, and they would prove crucial in the years to come, giving the resistance a structure and a reach down into every community. At the same time, the Congress was careful, almost desperate, to profess its continuing loyalty to the king. The delegates sent a respectful petition to George III, appealing to him over the heads of his ministers, asking him to redress their grievances and restore their rights. They still framed their quarrel as a dispute with Parliament and with the king's wicked advisers, not with the king himself. This was partly genuine, for many delegates truly hoped for reconciliation, and partly strategic, a way of keeping the moderates on board and of leaving the door to peace open. The colonists were not yet ready to declare themselves enemies of the crown. They wanted their old rights restored, and they hoped, against mounting evidence, that the king might yet listen. But beneath the careful language and the professions of loyalty, something fundamental had shifted, and the delegates surely sensed it, even if they did not all admit it. By gathering, by deliberating together, by organizing a continental boycott, and creating committees to enforce it, the colonies had begun to act as a single political entity. They had taken the machinery of resistance out of the hands of individual colonies and given it a continental shape. When the Congress adjourned, it agreed to meet again the following spring if the grievances had not been resolved. That agreement, almost an afterthought, meant that the colonies now had a standing mechanism for joint action, a body they could reconvene whenever the crisis demanded. The First Continental Congress dissolved with its members scattering back to their distant homes, but the thing it represented did not dissolve. The colonies had found their collective voice, and events were now moving faster than any of them realized. Even as the delegates rode home through the autumn countryside, the situation in Massachusetts was sliding toward open conflict. Militia companies were drilling on village greens. Stores of powder and shot were being quietly gathered. The British commander in Boston was watching it all and growing alarmed. The petitions and declarations and boycotts had not resolved the crisis. They had merely set the stage for the moment when words would give way to gunfire. By the spring of 1775, Massachusetts stood on the edge of war, though most of its people still hoped to step back from it. The British commander in Boston was General Thomas Gage, a careful and experienced officer who also happened to have an American wife and a genuine understanding of the colonists' temper. Gage could see what was happening in the countryside around Boston. The colonial militia, the ordinary farmers and townsmen who had always been expected to turn out for local defense, were now drilling with new seriousness. They were gathering muskets, powder, and cannon, building up stores of military supplies in towns outside the city. The shadow government created by the resistance was in effect preparing for the possibility of armed conflict. Gage understood that if he did nothing, the colonists would grow stronger and bolder, and that the moment might pass when he could still act decisively. So Gage decided to strike a preemptive blow, not to start a war, but as he saw it, to prevent one by removing the means to fight it. He learned that a significant store of military supplies had been gathered in the town of Concord, some miles inland from Boston. He resolved to send a force of soldiers out at night, quietly and quickly, to seize and destroy those supplies before the colonists could use them. He also hoped perhaps to capture some of the leading agitators, including Samuel Adams and John Hancock, who were known to be in the area. Secrecy was essential. If the colonists learned of the expedition in advance, they could move the supplies and rouse the countryside, and the whole operation would fail. But secrecy was almost impossible to keep in a town as watchful as Boston, where the Patriots had eyes everywhere, including, it was whispered, very close to the general himself. The colonial leaders had built an effective intelligence network, and they detected the signs of an impending British movement, the unusual activity among the troops, the boats being readied. On the night of the April 18, 1775, as the British column prepared to move, the Patriots set their warning system in motion. The plan was simple and famous. Lanterns would be hung in the steeple of the Old North Church to signal the route the British were taking. 1 if they marched out by land, 2 if they crossed the water first, and riders would carry the warning out into the countryside ahead of the soldiers, rousing the militia of every town along the way. The most famous of those riders was Paul Revere, the same silversmith whose engraving had spread the image of the Boston Massacre. Revere crossed the water from Boston, mounted a horse on the far side, and rode out into the night, spreading the alarm from farmhouse to farmhouse and town to town. He was not alone. Other riders rode other routes, and the warning multiplied as it spread, each roused town sending out its own messengers. The image we often carry of a single lone horseman is a simplification. It was a network, a system, and it worked. By the time the British soldiers were marching through the dark countryside, the militia of town after town was being pulled from sleep. Men reaching for muskets they had kept loaded and ready, mustering on village greens in the cold hours before dawn. The British column, several hundred strong, marched through the night toward Concord, and reached the small town of Lexington in the grey light of early morning. There on the village green they found a body of local militia drawn up to meet them. Perhaps 70 men, farmers and townsmen, vastly outnumbered by the disciplined regulars in front of them. What followed was confused, and the truth of it has never been fully settled. The British officers shouted at the militia to disperse, to lay down their arms and go home. The militia commander, recognizing the hopelessness of standing against such a force, apparently ordered his men to withdraw, though not to surrender their weapons. And then, in the tense and crowded confusion, a shot rang out. No one knows who fired it. Each side later blamed the other, and the truth was probably lost in the chaos of the moment. A single nervous finger on a trigger, perhaps a weapon discharged by accident or by some hothead on one side or the other. But it did not matter who fired first. Once that shot was fired, the British soldiers, tense and frightened themselves, loosed a volley into the militia and then charged. When the smoke cleared on Lexington Green, 8 colonists lay dead and others were wounded. The militia scattered. The British reformed their ranks and marched on toward Concord, believing the morning's unpleasant business was behind them. They could not have been more wrong. That single shot, fired by an unknown hand on a village green at dawn, would echo, as a poet would later write, around the world. It was the beginning of the war. At Concord, the British found that much of the military stores had already been moved or hidden, the warning having done its work. They destroyed what they could find, but it was little enough. And while they were about it, the militia of the surrounding towns was gathering in ever greater numbers on the high ground around the town. At the North Bridge over the Concord River, a body of militia advanced on the British troops guarding the crossing, and this time the colonists fired deliberately, killing and wounding several regulars and driving the rest back. The hunters were becoming the hunted. The British commander realized that his position was growing dangerous and that he needed to get his column back to the safety of Boston, and quickly. But the road back to Boston had become a gauntlet. All along the route, behind stone walls and trees and farm buildings, the militia of the countryside had gathered, hundreds and then thousands of them, drawn by the alarm that had spread through the night. As the British column marched back, the colonists poured fire into it from cover, firing and falling back and firing again, refusing to stand in the open where the regulars could come to grips with them. Instead, they harried the redcoats from every side. The disciplined British formation, trained for the open battlefields of Europe, found itself bleeding mile after mile along a road lined with hidden marksmen. The retreat became a nightmare. The column might have been destroyed entirely had it not been met by reinforcements sent out from Boston, who covered the exhausted survivors as they staggered back into the city. By the time the day was over, the British had suffered far heavier losses than the colonists, and the countryside around Boston was swarming with armed and angry militia. The war that no one had quite intended had begun, and there was no going back. In the days after Lexington and Concord, something remarkable happened around Boston. The militia who had harried the British back into the city did not go home. Instead, thousands upon thousands of armed colonists from Massachusetts and the neighboring colonies streamed toward Boston and formed a great ring around it, hemming the British army inside the town. Almost overnight, an army had assembled, not a professional army with uniforms and supply trains and trained officers, but a vast and ragged gathering of farmers and tradesmen with their own muskets, organized loosely by colony and town. General Gage and his redcoats, who had marched out to disarm a few troublemakers, now found themselves besieged in Boston by what amounted to a popular uprising in arms. This was the Siege of Boston, and it would last for the better part of a year. The colonists could not easily attack the city, which was defended by British warships and disciplined regulars. The British could not easily break out, surrounded as they were by an enemy that grew more numerous by the day, so the two sides settled into an uneasy standoff, each watching the other across the lines, while the political situation continued to develop. The Second Continental Congress, sitting in Philadelphia as the delegates had agreed the previous autumn, now found itself with a war on its hands, whether it wanted one or not. There was an army outside Boston, and someone had to take responsibility for it. The conflict was no longer a Massachusetts affair. It was becoming a continental one. The standoff around Boston broke into open battle in June of 1775. The colonists learned that the British intended to seize the high ground on the peninsulas overlooking the city, ground from which artillery could command the harbor and the town. To forestall them, the colonists moved first, sending men by night onto the Charlestown Peninsula to fortify the heights there. The hill that would give the battle its name was Bunker Hill, though much of the actual fighting took place on the neighboring Breed's Hill, a confusion of names that has tangled the story ever since. Through the dark hours, the colonists dug furiously, throwing up an earthen redoubt on the high ground, and when the sun rose, the astonished British found a fortified colonial position glaring down at them from the heights above Boston. General Gage and his officers decided to take the hill by direct assault. And here we see the collision between two ways of making war. The British were professional soldiers, masters of the disciplined frontal attack, trained to advance in ordered ranks against the enemy and break him with the steadiness of their advance and the shock of the bayonet. They formed up at the base of the hill, thousands of them, in their bright red coats, and began to march up the slope toward the colonial entrenchments in perfect order. A magnificent and terrifying sight. The colonists waited behind their earthworks, and their commanders, knowing their men were short of powder and unsteady, gave the order to hold their fire until the enemy was close. So close, the legend says, that they could see the whites of the redcoats' eyes. When the British reached that point, the colonists opened fire, and the effect was devastating. The massed volley tore through the advancing ranks at close range, and the British attack staggered and broke, the survivors falling back down the hill in disorder, leaving the slope strewn with dead and wounded. It was a stunning repulse, but British discipline was a remarkable thing, and the officers reformed their shattered ranks and sent them up the hill a second time. Again the colonists held their fire, and again the close volleys tore the British line apart, and again the attack collapsed. Twice the finest army in the world had marched up that hill, and twice it had been thrown back with terrible loss by a crowd of farmers behind a dirt wall. The British attacked a third time, and this time the outcome was different, not because their courage had grown, but because the colonists' powder had run out. The defenders, having fired away nearly all their ammunition in repelling the first two assaults, had little left to meet the third. As the British came up the hill once more, the colonial fire slackened and died, and the redcoats reached the entrenchments and came over the top with the bayonet. The fighting at the wall was savage and brief, and then the colonists, out of powder and unable to stand against the bayonet, fell back and abandoned the hill. The British had taken their objective. They held the ground at the end of the day. By the strict measure of the battlefield they had won, but it was a victory that felt very much like a defeat, and everyone on both sides understood it. The cost to the British had been appalling. They had suffered enormous casualties, more than 1,000 men killed or wounded, a staggering proportion of the force engaged, and among the dead and wounded was a fearful number of officers. They had taken a single hill at a price that no army could afford to pay very often. The British commander, surveying the carnage, is said to have remarked that a few more such victories would utterly ruin them. And he was entirely right. The battle taught both sides a sobering lesson. It taught the British that the colonists, untrained as they were, would stand and fight and kill. That this would be no easy police action against a rabble, but a real and bloody war. And it taught the colonists that they could face the finest soldiers in the world and make them pay dearly, that the redcoats were not invincible, that ordinary men with muskets and courage could stand against an empire. Bunker Hill gave the colonial cause something it badly needed at that early and uncertain moment, which was confidence, and it gave the British a grim foretaste of how long and costly the road ahead would be. The war would not be settled in a single season. It would grind on for years, and the men in Philadelphia now had to find someone capable of leading the rough colonial army through whatever was coming. The Second Continental Congress, sitting in Philadelphia while the army outside Boston grew restless and the British prepared for a long fight, faced a question it could no longer avoid. The colonies had an army, but it was an army in name only, a sprawling collection of New England militia, bound together by little more than shared anger and a common enemy. It had no unified command, no proper organization, no agreed structure, and no clear authority over it, beyond the towns and colonies that had sent the men. If this was to become a continental war, the army would have to become a continental army, and a continental army needed a commander, a single man whom all the colonies could accept and follow. The choice the Congress made was both practical and shrewd, and it would prove to be one of the most important decisions in the entire history of the new nation. The army around Boston was overwhelmingly a New England force, and there was a real danger that the rest of the colonies might come to see the whole struggle as a New England quarrel, a regional affair that the southern and middle colonies need not fully embrace. To bind the colonies together, it made sense to choose a commander from outside New England, a man whose appointment would signal that this was truly a common cause. And so the Congress turned to a delegate from Virginia, a tall, dignified, and reserved planter who had served with distinction in the French and Indian War, and who had taken to attending the Congress in his old military uniform, a quiet but unmistakable signal of where his thoughts lay. His name was George Washington. Washington was in many ways an inspired choice, though not because he was the most brilliant military mind of his age. He was not. He had known real defeat in his earlier career, and he would know more of it in the war to come. His gifts lay elsewhere, and they were precisely the gifts the situation demanded. He was a man of immense personal dignity and self-command, a presence who inspired confidence and respect simply by entering a room. He was a Southerner, a Virginian whose appointment helped knit the colonies together. He was wealthy enough to serve without pay, and he made a point of refusing a salary, which impressed everyone and quietly established him as a man above ordinary ambition. And above all, he possessed a quality rarer than brilliance and more useful in a long war, which was endurance. Washington could absorb defeat, hold an army together through disaster and despair, and simply refuse to quit. In a struggle that would be decided not by a single brilliant stroke, but by the sheer capacity to keep fighting year after year, this was worth more than genius. When Washington arrived at the camp outside Boston in the summer of 1775 and took command of the army, he was dismayed by what he found. And he did not entirely hide his dismay. The men were brave enough, but they were undisciplined, disorganized, and deeply resistant to the kind of order he believed an army required. They had little sense of military hierarchy. They elected their own officers in many cases, came and went somewhat as they pleased, and regarded the formal discipline of European armies with the suspicion of free men who had taken up arms precisely to resist being ordered about. Sanitation in the camps was poor, supplies were short, and enlistments were often for terms so brief that the army threatened to dissolve and reform every few months as men's time expired and they went home to their farms. Washington set himself to the slow, frustrating, unglamorous work of turning this gathering of armed citizens into something resembling an army. He imposed discipline, organized the camps, established a chain of command, and labored constantly to keep his force together and supplied. It was thankless work, and it would consume him for years. The romantic image of the Revolution is full of battles and brave charges, but the truer image of Washington's war is a man sitting up late by candlelight, writing yet another desperate letter to Congress, begging for money, for supplies, for longer enlistments, for the basic means to keep his army from melting away. The greatest enemy Washington faced was often not the British at all. It was hunger, desertion, expiring enlistments, and the chronic, grinding shortage of everything an army needs. The siege of Boston dragged on through the rest of 1775 and into the early months of 1776, the two armies watching each other across the lines, while Washington struggled to hold his force together. The deadlock was finally broken by a stroke of initiative and a remarkable feat of logistics. Far to the west, the colonists had captured a British fort, Fort Ticonderoga, and with it a quantity of heavy cannon. A resourceful young officer named Henry Knox, a former bookseller with a passion for artillery, undertook to bring those guns to Boston. An extraordinary journey, hauling tons of heavy artillery over frozen rivers and through the winter wilderness by ox sled. That the guns arrived at all was something close to a miracle, and they changed everything. Washington had the cannon hauled up onto the heights of Dorchester, high ground overlooking Boston and its harbor, doing it secretly over a single night so that the British, like the colonists at Bunker Hill, woke to find the heights above them suddenly bristling with guns. But this time the positions were too strong to assault, and the cannon commanded the harbor where the British fleet lay. General Howe, who had replaced Gage in command, faced a grim choice. He could try to storm the heights and risk another Bunker Hill or worse, or he could abandon the city. He chose to abandon it. In March of 1776, the British Army and a crowd of Loyalist refugees boarded their ships and sailed away from Boston, leaving the town in colonial hands. It was a tremendous victory, one without a great battle, and it lifted colonial spirits enormously. But Washington was under no illusions. The British had not been beaten. They had merely withdrawn to gather their strength, and they would be back in far greater force, and soon. The war was just beginning, and the colonies were about to take a step from which there could be no return. Through the first year of fighting, a strange and growing tension ran beneath the colonial cause, a contradiction that could not be sustained forever. The colonists were at war with the armies of their king, and yet they continued officially to profess their loyalty to that same king and to insist that they sought only the restoration of their rights as British subjects, not separation from Britain. They were fighting a war they refused to name as a war for independence. Men were dying at Lexington and Bunker Hill in the name of liberties they claimed as Englishmen, while the Congress sent yet another humble petition to the king, begging for reconciliation. This could not last. Sooner or later, the colonists would have to decide what they were actually fighting for. Several things pushed them toward a decision through the early months of 1776. The king himself helped by rejecting the colonists' final petition, declaring the colonies in open rebellion, and hiring foreign mercenaries, German soldiers, to help crush them. To the colonists, the news that their king was sending paid foreign troops to make war on them was a profound shock, and it shattered much of the lingering affection many still felt for the crown. It is hard to keep professing loyalty to a monarch who is hiring foreigners to shoot you. The sense of being subjects appealing to a benevolent father gave way to the sense of being a people abandoned by a hostile one. And then there was a pamphlet, one of the most influential pieces of writing in all of history, published in the early days of 1776 by a recent immigrant from England named Thomas Paine. He called it Common Sense, and it did something the cautious gentlemen of the Congress had never quite dared to do. It attacked not just Parliament, not just the king's ministers, but the whole institution of monarchy itself, and it argued in plain, blazing, accessible language that any ordinary colonist could understand that the colonies should simply cut their ties with Britain and govern themselves. Paine swept aside the careful distinctions and timid hopes of reconciliation, and said the unsayable, that it was absurd for a vast continent to be ruled by a distant island, that hereditary monarchy was a ridiculous and corrupt institution, that the time for independence had come. Common Sense sold in staggering numbers and was read aloud in taverns and homes across the colonies. It gave ordinary people the words and the arguments for what many had begun to feel but had not dared to say. It made independence thinkable, even obvious. By the summer of 1776, the momentum had become irresistible. In the Continental Congress, the radicals who had long believed independence inevitable now found the moderates coming around, pushed by events, by the king's actions, by Paine's arguments, by the simple logic of a war that could not be ended any other way. A resolution was introduced declaring the colonies to be free and independent states. The Congress, taking the step at last, appointed a committee to draft a formal declaration explaining to the world why the colonies were separating from Britain. The committee included John Adams of Massachusetts and the venerable Benjamin Franklin of Pennsylvania, the famous printer, scientist, and diplomat, the most celebrated American of his age. But the actual writing was entrusted to a young Virginia delegate, a quiet, bookish, and brilliant lawyer named Thomas Jefferson, who possessed a gift for language that his colleagues recognized and respected. Jefferson labored over the document in his rented rooms, drawing on a whole tradition of political philosophy, on the ideas of the Enlightenment, on the long English struggle for liberty, and distilling it all into a statement of breathtaking clarity and power. The heart of it was a set of propositions he declared to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed with certain unalienable rights, among them life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed, existing to secure those rights, and may rightfully be altered or abolished when they fail to do so. With those words, Jefferson lifted the colonial quarrel out of the realm of taxes and trade disputes and grounded it in a universal claim about human rights and the proper basis of government. It was a justification not just for this rebellion, but in principle for the rights of people everywhere. When Jefferson submitted his draft, the Congress went over it line by line, and the experience nearly drove the sensitive young author to despair as the delegates cut and altered his careful prose. Franklin, sitting beside him, offered gentle consolation about the perils of submitting one's writing to the judgment of a committee. Most of the changes were small, but one was enormous. Jefferson had included a passage bitterly condemning the slave trade and blaming the king for it, and the Congress struck it out, partly to please delegates from colonies that depended on slavery. So the document that proclaimed all men created equal was edited at its birth to protect the institution of slavery. The contradiction we noted at the beginning, written directly into the founding moment. The men who signed that declaration knew they were committing what the Crown would regard as treason, an offense punishable by death, and they understood the risk perfectly well. To sign was to stake one's life, one's fortune, and one's honor on the success of the rebellion, for if it failed, the signers could expect the gallows. On the July 4, 1776, the Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence. It was read aloud in public, printed and distributed, carried to the army and read to the troops. The colonies were no longer rebellious provinces seeking redress. They were, by their own proclamation, free and independent states, a new nation declaring itself before the world. There could be no turning back now, no return to the comfortable old arrangement, no reconciliation. It was independence or ruin. And the British, who had been gathering an enormous force to crush the rebellion once and for all, were about to deliver a blow that would test whether the bold words of July could survive the brutal realities of the battlefield. Even as the declaration was being read in the streets, the largest military force Britain had ever sent across the Atlantic was assembling in the waters of New York. The British had learned the lesson of Boston. They would not waste their strength besieging a hostile New England town again. Instead, they would strike at New York City, a port of central importance, a place with a large loyalist population, and a base from which they could control the Hudson River and potentially split the rebellious colonies in two, cutting New England off from the rest. The force they gathered for the task was overwhelming. Tens of thousands of disciplined regulars and hired German troops, supported by a vast fleet of warships, the whole commanded by General William Howe and his brother, the Admiral. It was a hammer assembled to smash the rebellion in a single campaign. Washington, anticipating the blow, had marched his army down from Boston to defend New York, but the task was nearly impossible from the start. New York sat on islands surrounded by water, and water was the element the British Navy ruled absolutely. Washington had no fleet to speak of, which meant the British could land their troops wherever they chose, and could move them by water faster than Washington could march to meet them. To defend a city of islands against an enemy who commanded the sea, with an army smaller, less trained, and far less well-equipped than the foe, was a soldier's nightmare. Washington tried anyway, partly because Congress and the public expected New York to be defended, and the attempt nearly destroyed his army and the cause along with it. The campaign that unfolded across the late summer and autumn of 1776 was a chronicle of defeat. The British landed in force and met Washington's army in battle on Long Island, where superior numbers and a clever flanking maneuver shattered the American position and drove the survivors back in disorder to the fortified lines around Brooklyn. There, with his back to the river and the victorious British in front of him, Washington faced the destruction of his entire force. Had Howe pressed the attack, the war might have ended then and there. But Howe, perhaps remembering the slaughter at Bunker Hill, chose to proceed cautiously and lay siege rather than storm the lines. That caution gave Washington his chance, and he seized it with one of the most skillful operations of his career, evacuating his entire army across the river by night in small boats, under cover of darkness and a fortunate fog, slipping away before the British realized they were gone. He had saved the army barely, but he had lost the battle, and the retreat had only begun. What followed was a long, grinding withdrawal, a season of nearly unbroken disaster. The British pressed their advantage, landing on Manhattan, forcing Washington out of the city, capturing thousands of his men, along with vast quantities of irreplaceable supplies. When an important fort fell, Washington retreated north, then west across the Hudson, then south through New Jersey, the British Army following close behind. His force dwindled with every mile. Men deserted, enlistments expired, and men went home. The sick and the discouraged fell away. The army that had numbered many thousands at the start of the campaign shrank to a few thousand cold, hungry, exhausted men, retreating across the bleak winter landscape of New Jersey, with the enemy at their heels, and seemingly nothing ahead of them but final defeat. These were the darkest days of the war, the moment when the whole enterprise came closest to simply collapsing. The cause that had been proclaimed with such confidence in July seemed by December to be dying. The British appeared invincible. New Jersey, overrun, saw many of its inhabitants make their peace with the Crown, accepting British offers of pardon, abandoning a cause that looked lost. Thomas Paine, who was with the army during the retreat, captured the mood in a new pamphlet that began with the famous observation that these were the times that tried men's souls, that the summer soldier and the sunshine patriot would shrink from the service of their country in such a crisis, but that those who stood firm now deserved the love and thanks of all. He wrote it is said, on a drumhead by the light of a campfire during the retreat, which is the kind of detail that sounds invented but happens to be roughly true. For Washington, the situation was very nearly hopeless, and he knew it with a clarity that would have crushed a lesser man. His army was disintegrating before his eyes, and there was a deadline looming that made everything worse, for the enlistments of much of what remained of his force were due to expire with the end of the year, only weeks away. When that day came, most of his remaining soldiers would have the legal right to go home, and many of them surely would, leaving him with almost nothing. If the war was to be saved, something had to happen before the year ran out. Some stroke that could reverse the tide of defeat, restore the army's shattered confidence, and give men a reason to stay and keep fighting. The odds against finding such a stroke were enormous. Washington had been beaten and beaten again across the whole long campaign. But in the desperate final days of 1776, with his cause apparently in its death throes, he conceived a plan as bold as it was risky, a gamble that would either revive the revolution or finish it. He fixed his eyes across the icy Delaware River, where the enemy lay encamped in winter quarters, careless and confident, certain that the rebel army was finished. The plan Washington devised in those last desperate days of 1776 was audacious to the point of recklessness, which was exactly what the situation required. His army had retreated across the Delaware River into Pennsylvania, gathering up every boat for miles along the riverbank, so the pursuing British could not follow. On the far side in New Jersey, the British and their German allies had spread out into winter quarters, settling into towns along the river to wait out the cold months before finishing off the rebellion in the spring. The war, by the custom of the age, largely paused in winter. Armies did not campaign in the snow and ice if they could help it. The enemy felt safe, and they had every reason to. The rebel army was beaten, shrinking, and trapped on the wrong side of a frozen river. No sane commander would attack. That was precisely why Washington decided to do it. In the town of Trenton, just across the river, sat a garrison of German soldiers, professional troops hired by the British to fight the Americans. Washington reasoned that an attack on Trenton, struck suddenly and from an unexpected direction in the dead of winter, might catch the garrison entirely off guard. If it succeeded, it would give his dying cause a victory, any victory, something to show the world and his own dwindling army that the war was not yet lost. He planned to cross the Delaware in secret on the night after Christmas, when he hoped the garrison would be relaxed and unwary, march on Trenton through the dark, and fall upon the enemy at dawn. The crossing itself was a fearful ordeal, and it nearly failed before it began. The night of the 25th of December, 1776, was bitterly cold, and the weather turned vicious as the army gathered at the riverbank. The Delaware was choked with great chunks of floating ice, grinding and churning in the current, and a storm of sleet and snow howled down on the men as they began to load themselves and their cannon into the boats. It was a desperate, dangerous business. Men and horses and heavy guns ferried across a freezing river in the dark amid drifting ice. The whole operation hours behind schedule and conducted in conditions that would have stopped most armies cold. Other crossings that were meant to support the attack failed entirely, defeated by the ice and the weather, so that Washington's column would have to do the work alone. By the time the army was across and formed up on the New Jersey side, it was far later than planned, and there was no longer any hope of attacking before dawn. Washington pressed on anyway. There was no turning back now. The exhausted, frozen army marched through the storm toward Trenton in the gray light of early morning, the men struggling forward through the snow, some of them, it is said, leaving bloody footprints from feet wrapped in rags rather than shod in proper boots. They reached the town and fell upon the garrison in a sudden, furious assault. The German troops, taken completely by surprise, roused from their quarters into a chaos of musket fire and shouting and confusion, never had a chance to organize a proper defense. The battle was sharp and short. The garrison was overwhelmed, its commander mortally wounded, hundreds of its men killed, wounded, or captured. Washington's losses were tiny by comparison. In a single morning, the beaten and despairing rebel army had won a clean and stunning victory. The military value of Trenton, measured in men and ground, was modest, but its effect on the spirit of the cause was enormous, far out of proportion to its size. At the very moment when the revolution seemed to be expiring, when defeat had piled upon defeat and the army was melting away, Washington had struck back and won. The news flashed through the colonies and revived flagging hopes everywhere. It gave Washington soldiers a reason to believe again, and crucially, it helped persuade many of them, their enlistments expiring, to stay with the army a little longer rather than going home. A victory, even a small one, changes everything when men have grown used to defeat. Washington was not content to stop there. Sensing that the initiative had shifted, he recrossed into New Jersey and struck again. The British, stung by the loss at Trenton, sent a strong force to trap and destroy his little army, and for a moment Washington was nearly caught, pinned against the river with a superior enemy bearing down on him. But on the night before the expected battle, he slipped away once more, leaving his campfires burning to deceive the enemy, while his army marched quietly around the British flank through the dark. At Princeton the next morning, he fell upon and defeated another British force, then withdrew his army into the hills of New Jersey to safe winter quarters. In the space of about 10 days, Washington had transformed the entire complexion of the war. He had taken an army on the edge of dissolution and a cause on the edge of collapse, and through audacity and endurance had won 2 victories that breathed new life into both. The British, who had been confident in December that the rebellion was all but finished, were forced to pull back and reconsider. They abandoned much of New Jersey, conceding ground they had thought securely won. The colonists, who had been making their peace with the Crown, took heart again. The story of the Revolution had nearly ended in the snow of that terrible December with a beaten army and a dying cause. Instead, against all probability, it had been rescued by a desperate gamble across an icy river. The war was far from over. Years of hard fighting lay ahead, with defeats yet to come that would rival the disasters of 1776. But the cause had survived its darkest hour, and as the armies settled into their winter quarters, the people of the colonies could believe once more that independence might actually be won. Before we follow the war into its next great turning, it is worth pausing to look at the world these people inhabited, the ordinary life that continued beneath the marching and the fighting, the texture of the society for which the war was being fought. While armies marched and battles raged, the great majority of colonists went on living their ordinary lives. And to understand the Revolution, it helps to understand the world those lives were lived in. This was a society sharply divided by rank and wealth, far more so than later American myths would like to remember, and a person's place in that hierarchy shaped nearly everything about how they lived, dressed, ate, and were treated. At the top stood the gentry, the wealthy elite, the great merchants of the northern cities and the great planters of the southern colonies. These were the families of money and influence, the men who sat in the assemblies and led the Congress and commanded the army. A wealthy planter like Washington, or a prosperous merchant, lived in a fine brick or stone house with many rooms, furnished with imported goods, served by enslaved people or paid servants. The gentry dressed to display their status, the men in well-cut coats and waistcoats of fine fabric, in breeches and silk stockings and shoes with polished buckles, their hair often powdered or covered with a wig, for a powdered head was a mark of a gentleman who did not labor with his hands. The women of this class wore elaborate gowns of silk and fine cotton, layered over stays and petticoats, their dress a statement of wealth and refinement. These people ate well, dining on meat and fish and imported delicacies, drinking wine and Madeira and the contested tea, eating off proper china at tables set with silver. Below the gentry stood the broad, middling sort, and this was the heart of colonial society, far larger and more important than the elite above it. These were the independent farmers who owned their own land, the artisans and craftsmen of the towns, the shopkeepers and tradesmen, and lesser professionals. A middling farmer worked his own fields, perhaps with the help of his family and a hired hand or two, and lived in a modest but comfortable wooden house. The men of this class dressed plainly and practically in coats and breeches of sturdy wool or linen, in clothing made to work in rather than to display. Many wore garments spun and woven at home, and during the boycott of British goods, homespun cloth became a positive badge of patriotic virtue, a way of wearing one's politics. Their food was plain and hearty, built around the produce of their own land: bread and cornmeal, pork and salt fish, beans and vegetables from the garden, cider to drink. They ate to be nourished for labor, not to display refinement, and they ate seasonally, preserving and salting what they could against the winter. Below the middling sort came the laboring poor, those who owned no land and worked for others, the hired hands and servants, the laborers and sailors, the journeymen who worked at another man's trade for wages. Their lives were harder and more precarious, their clothing rougher and more worn, often handed down or patched, their food simpler still, and sometimes scarce. Many of the poor began their working lives as indentured servants, having sold years of their labor in exchange for passage across the Atlantic, bound to a master until their term was served. They occupied the lower rungs of the free population, a step above the bottom, but living always close to want. And at the very bottom, outside the hierarchy of free society altogether, were the enslaved, the hundreds of thousands of people of African descent held in bondage throughout the colonies, most heavily in the South. They owned nothing, not even themselves. They labored in the fields of the plantations and in the homes and workshops of their owners, dressed in the coarsest cloth provided by their masters, fed on the cheapest rations, their lives entirely subject to the will of those who claimed to own them. The grand talk of liberty that filled the air in these years was not lost on them, and the contradiction between the colonists' demands for freedom and their practice of slavery was glaring. Many enslaved people grasped the opportunity the war presented, and thousands fled to the British, who offered freedom to those who would abandon rebel masters and join the king's cause. The war over liberty was, for the enslaved, a complicated and dangerous chance to seize a liberty of their own. Beyond these ranks of class, daily life in the colonies moved to rhythms that would seem strange to us now. Light came from candles and the fire, and so the day largely followed the sun. Heat came from the hearth, around which the life of a household gathered, and where the cooking was done over open flame. Water was hauled by hand. Travel was slow by horse or wagon over rough roads, or by boat along the rivers and coast. Disease was a constant and frightening companion, and medicine could do little against it, so that families expected to lose children and braced themselves against the regular visitations of sickness. Religion ran deep through this society, shaping its calendar, its morality, and its sense of meaning, though it varied enormously from the strict Protestant traditions of New England to the established Anglican Church of Virginia and the remarkable religious diversity of Pennsylvania. Women in this world, regardless of class, occupied a position of profound legal and social subordination. Their lives largely defined by household and family, their property and legal identity, absorbed into their husbands upon marriage. Yet within those constraints, women ran the complex economy of the household, managed farms and businesses when their men were away at war, and during the conflict took on the burden of keeping homes and farms and shops going while the men marched and fought. The boycott depended heavily on women, who made the decisions about what the household would and would not buy, and who spun the homespun cloth that replaced British imports. The revolution reached into the kitchen and the spinning room as surely as it reached onto the battlefield. This was the society, layered and unequal, religious and laborious, that the revolution was being fought over and through. The grand words about equality and rights were spoken in a world that was anything but equal, by men who lived at the top of a steep hierarchy. The gap between the ideal and the reality was wide, and it would remain wide for generations. But the ideal, once proclaimed, had a life of its own, and it would press against the reality long after the war was over. For now, though, the war itself still hung in the balance, and far to the north, a British plan was unfolding that would bring the conflict to its first great turning point. In 1777, the British devised a grand strategy that they believed would end the rebellion by cutting it in half. The plan was built around the geography of the northern colonies, and on paper it had a certain logic. New England was the heart of the rebellion, the most defiant and committed of the regions. If New England could be severed from the rest of the colonies, the British reasoned, the revolution might be strangled. The way to do it ran along the line of lakes and rivers that stretched from Canada south to New York City, the natural corridor of the Hudson and the waters above it. If British armies could gain control of that whole corridor, they would split the colonies in two, isolating New England and crushing the rebellion piece by piece. The plan called for a British army to march south from Canada down through the Lake Country, aiming to link up eventually with forces moving north from New York City, sealing the corridor between them. The army from Canada was led by General John Burgoyne, a confident and somewhat theatrical officer, fond of fine living and grand gestures, who set off southward in the summer of 1777 at the head of a substantial force of British regulars, German troops, Canadians, and native allies, with a long train of artillery and a baggage train that reportedly included a generous supply of the general's personal comforts. He began well. He recaptured Fort Ticonderoga, which fell with surprising ease, and the news of its loss dismayed the Americans and delighted London. Burgoyne pressed confidently southward, certain of success, but the confident plan began to unravel as it met the realities of the American wilderness and the resistance of the people. The country between Canada and the Hudson was rough, heavily forested, laced with rivers and swamps, and the Americans did everything they could to make Burgoyne's progress a misery. They felled trees across the trails, destroyed bridges, and obstructed the rivers, so that Burgoyne's army, burdened with its heavy guns and baggage, was forced to hack its way forward at a crawl, building roads and bridges as it went, its advance slowing to a few painful miles a day. The army's supply lines stretched back through hostile country, growing longer and more fragile with every mile, while the force it was supposed to meet coming up from New York, for reasons of British miscommunication and competing priorities, never came. Burgoyne marched on toward a meeting that would not take place, deeper and deeper into a country that was closing around him. The local population, far from welcoming the British as liberators, rose against them. As Burgoyne's army advanced, and as word spread of violence committed by his native allies, including the killing of settlers, the militia of New England and New York turned out in growing numbers, swelling the American forces gathering to oppose him. A detachment Burgoyne sent off to gather supplies and horses was ambushed and destroyed by American militia, a sharp blow that cost him hundreds of men he could not replace and warned him that the countryside was rising. His army grew weaker and more isolated with each passing week, its supplies dwindling, its line of retreat lengthening, the American forces in front of and around it growing stronger by the day. The bold thrust to split the colonies was turning into a trap, and Burgoyne was marching into the jaws of it. The American army that gathered to oppose Burgoyne was commanded by General Horatio Gates, but its fighting was driven in large part by the energy and aggression of other officers and by the sheer weight of militia that had assembled. Among those who distinguished themselves in the hard fighting was a brilliant and reckless field commander named Benedict Arnold, whose name would later become a byword for treason, but who in these battles fought with conspicuous courage and skill. The two armies clashed in a series of fierce engagements in the autumn of 1777 near a place called Saratoga, on the Hudson. The fighting was bloody and hard, and though the British gave a good account of themselves, they could not break the American position. And each battle left Burgoyne weaker, while the Americans, constantly reinforced, grew stronger. After the second great battle, Burgoyne found himself in an impossible position. His army was battered, outnumbered, low on supplies, surrounded by a growing American host, and cut off from any hope of relief or retreat. There was nothing left to do but surrender. In October of 1777, Burgoyne gave up his entire army, thousands of British and German soldiers laying down their arms before the Americans. It was the greatest American victory of the war so far, the capture of an entire British army in the field, and its consequences reached far beyond the battlefield, all the way across the Atlantic. For the surrender at Saratoga did something the Americans needed even more than the soldiers and guns it yielded. It convinced France. France, Britain's great rival, had been watching the American war with keen interest, quietly sending some aid to the rebels in hopes of weakening her old enemy, but holding back from open commitment, unwilling to risk a war with Britain on behalf of a cause that might collapse. Benjamin Franklin had been in Paris for many months, working with all his considerable charm and cunning to draw the French into an open alliance, and the French had hesitated, waiting to see whether the Americans could actually win. Saratoga was the proof they had been waiting for. Here was an American army that had captured an entire British army in the field. The rebellion was real. The Americans could fight and win. And the moment had come to strike at Britain. In the wake of Saratoga, France agreed to a formal alliance with the United States, recognizing American independence and committing to the war. With that, the whole character of the conflict changed. What had been a colonial rebellion became a world war, with the might of France, her army, and above all her great navy, thrown into the balance against Britain. The Americans were no longer alone. The same winter that followed the triumph at Saratoga brought one of the hardest trials of the entire war, and it came not on a battlefield, but in a cold encampment in the Pennsylvania countryside. After failing to prevent the British from capturing Philadelphia, the American capital, in the campaigning of 1777, Washington led his weary army into winter quarters at a place called Valley Forge, some miles outside the occupied city. There the army would wait out the cold months, and there it would suffer terribly, not from enemy attack, but from cold, hunger, disease, and the chronic failures of supply that had plagued the cause from the beginning. The army that settled into Valley Forge in December of 1777 was in a wretched state. The men built rough log huts to shelter themselves against the winter, but shelter was the least of their wants. They lacked food, often going days with little or nothing to eat, as the supply system broke down. They lacked clothing, many of them in rags, and they lacked shoes, so that the sight of soldiers leaving bloody footprints in the snow, which had marked the march to Trenton the year before, became a common one through that long winter. They lacked blankets to keep warm and medicine to treat the sick. Disease swept through the crowded, undernourished, ill-clad camp, and men died by the thousands over the course of the winter, not in battle, but of sickness, exposure, and want. It was a slow agony, and it tested the endurance of the army and its commander as severely as any battle. The suffering at Valley Forge was in large part a failure of organization and supply, rather than a lack of resources in the country at large. There was food and clothing to be had in America. The problem was getting it to the army, a problem of money, of administration, of a Congress without the power to tax, and a supply system riddled with inefficiency and sometimes corruption. Washington bombarded Congress with desperate appeals through that winter, describing the sufferings of his men and warning that the army might simply dissolve if it was not fed and clothed. That it held together at all through cold and hunger and death was a testament to the endurance of the soldiers who stayed, and to the steadiness of the commander who shared their hardship and refused to abandon them. Washington's greatest achievement that winter was simply that there was still an army when spring came. But Valley Forge was not only a story of suffering, it was also, remarkably, the place where the Continental Army was transformed into a far more capable fighting force than it had ever been. The agent of that transformation was a foreign volunteer, a Prussian officer named Friedrich von Steuben, who arrived at the camp during that hard winter, offering his services to the American cause. Von Steuben had served in the army of Frederick the Great, the finest military machine in Europe, and he brought with him a deep knowledge of the drill, discipline, and organization that made European armies so formidable. He found an American army full of brave men who had never been properly trained, who did not know how to maneuver in formation, how to handle their weapons with uniform efficiency, how to move and fight as disciplined units rather than as a collection of individuals. Von Steuben set about teaching them, and he did it with energy, skill, and a certain colorful temper that became legendary in the camp. He spoke little English at first and would bellow his commands in a mixture of German and French, cursing magnificently in several languages when the men got it wrong, his oaths interpreted for the troops by aides who struggled to keep up. He drilled the soldiers relentlessly through the winter, starting with a model company that he trained himself and then using them to spread the new methods through the whole army. He taught them how to march and maneuver, how to load and fire with uniform precision, how to use the bayonet, how to move from column into line and back again under fire. He wrote a manual of drill and regulations that would standardize the training of the army. And slowly, over that long winter, the ragged soldiers of Valley Forge became something they had never quite been before, a trained and disciplined army, capable of standing and maneuvering against British regulars on equal terms. The difference von Steuben made would show itself when the army marched out of Valley Forge in the spring. When the British evacuated Philadelphia and moved back toward New York, Washington pursued them, and the two armies clashed at Monmouth, in New Jersey, in the summer of 1778. There, in a long and brutal battle fought in fearful heat, the Continental Army demonstrated how far it had come. The American troops stood their ground against the British regulars, maneuvered with a new steadiness, and held the field. The battle was not a decisive victory, but it proved that the army forged in the misery of Valley Forge could fight the British on something approaching even terms in open battle. The suffering of that winter had not been in vain. Out of cold and hunger and death had come a real army. And with the French alliance now adding its weight to the cause, the Americans had reason to believe that the long war might at last be turning in their favor. The strategic picture had shifted as well. With France in the war, Britain now faced a global conflict, forced to defend her possessions and interests around the world, no longer able to concentrate her whole strength on subduing the American colonies. The entry of France would later be joined by Spain and the Dutch, drawing still more of Britain's strength away. The British, Unable to crush the rebellion in the north, where Washington's reinvigorated army stood in their way, and facing a wider war on many fronts, began to look elsewhere for a path to victory. They turned their gaze to the south, to the colonies where they believed Loyalist sentiment ran strongest, and where they hoped to find the support and the success that had eluded them in the north. The war was about to enter a new and especially brutal phase, fought across the southern colonies in a campaign of marches, sieges, and savage partisan struggle. Frustrated in the north, where Washington's army blocked the path to a decisive victory, the British turned in the later years of the war toward a new strategy centered on the southern colonies. The reasoning behind it was hopeful, and as it turned out, badly mistaken. The British believed that the South was full of loyalists, colonists still faithful to the crown, who would rally to the king's standard if only a British army arrived to protect and encourage them. The plan was to use British regulars to seize key southern points and then to raise and arm the loyalist population, reconquering the South colony by colony, rolling up the rebellion from the bottom upward. It was a strategy that depended on the loyalists being as numerous, as committed, and as willing to fight as the British imagined. And that assumption would prove to be the fatal flaw at the heart of the whole Southern campaign. At first, the strategy seemed to work brilliantly. The British captured Savannah in Georgia, and then in 1780 they struck at Charleston, the great port and the most important city of the Southern colonies. The campaign against Charleston ended in a disaster for the Americans, as a substantial American army was trapped in the city and forced to surrender. Thousands of soldiers and a great quantity of arms and supplies lost at a stroke. It was one of the worst American defeats of the entire war, comparable to the catastrophes around New York 4 years earlier. With Charleston taken and a major American army eliminated, the British seemed poised to overrun the South, and they pressed inland to complete the conquest. But the deeper they pushed into the southern interior, the more the British strategy began to come apart. And it came apart for reasons that revealed the true nature of the war in the South. The expected Loyalist uprising never materialized on the scale the British had counted on. There were Loyalists, certainly, many of them, and the South was bitterly and violently divided. But there were also fierce patriots, and the British presence, far from pacifying the country, ignited a savage civil war between neighbors. The southern backcountry dissolved into a vicious internal conflict, a war of ambush and reprisal, of raids and burnings and killings, neighbor against neighbor, in which the formal armies were almost secondary to the brutal local struggle. The British and their Loyalist allies committed harsh acts that drove many waverers into the Patriot camp. For nothing makes a rebel faster than seeing one's home burned and one's kin killed. Into this chaos came the partisan leaders, irregular commanders who waged a guerrilla war against the British and their Loyalist supporters with great effect. Men like Francis Marion, who came to be called the Swamp Fox, led small bands of fighters who struck suddenly at British supply lines and detachments and then vanished into the swamps and forests where the regulars could not follow. These partisans never won great battles, but they made the British hold on the southern interior precarious and exhausting, harassing them constantly, cutting their supplies, and preventing them from ever truly controlling the country they had supposedly conquered. The British could win the set-piece battles and take the towns, but they could not hold the countryside, and a conquest that cannot be held is no conquest at all. The Continental forces in the South, after the disaster at Charleston, were rebuilt under a new commander, Nathaniel Greene, who proved to be one of the ablest American generals of the war. Greene understood that he could not defeat the British in a straight contest of strength, so he fought a different kind of war, one of maneuver and attrition, designed not to win battles outright, but to wear the enemy down. He divided his forces, drew the British into long and exhausting pursuits across the difficult southern country, and fought engagements in which, even when he was driven from the field, he inflicted losses the British could not afford. Greene is supposed to have described his method by saying that he fought, got beaten, rose, and fought again. And that captures the essence of his campaign perfectly. He lost battles but won the campaign, bleeding the British army white with every encounter, so that even their victories left them weaker. The British commander in the south, General Charles Cornwallis, found himself caught in exactly the trap Greene was setting. His victories cost him men and strength he could not replace. His supply lines were harassed without rest by the partisans. The loyalist support he had counted on never proved sufficient, and the country refused to be pacified. He marched and fought and won and grew weaker, chasing an enemy who would not be pinned down, and who grew stronger even as Cornwallis grew weaker. Worn down by the long and inconclusive campaign in the Carolinas, frustrated by his inability to bring the war to a decisive end, Cornwallis made a fateful decision. He would march his army north into Virginia, where he hoped to find a better strategic situation and, perhaps, a decisive result. He moved his army to a place on the Virginia coast, a small tobacco port on a peninsula where he could be supplied and supported by the British Navy, and from which he could conduct operations into the surrounding country. The place was called Yorktown. In choosing it, Cornwallis placed his army in a position that would prove to be a trap, and the Americans and their French allies were about to spring it. The opportunity that presented itself at Yorktown in the late summer of 1781 was the kind that comes once in a war, and Washington, who had waited years for exactly such a chance, seized it with a speed and decisiveness that surprised everyone, including the enemy. Cornwallis had established his army at Yorktown on a narrow peninsula in Virginia, relying on the British Navy to keep him supplied and, if necessary, to evacuate or reinforce him by sea. The whole position depended on British control of the water. As long as the British fleet ruled the Chesapeake, Cornwallis was secure, able to be supplied and supported, and in the last resort taken off by ship. But if that control of the sea were lost even briefly, the army at Yorktown would be cut off, trapped on its peninsula with no way out. And that is precisely the situation the Americans and French now worked to create. The key to Yorktown lay in the combination of land and sea power that the French alliance made possible, and in a feat of coordination across vast distances that came together with almost miraculous precision. A large French fleet under Admiral de Grasse was operating in the waters of America, and word reached Washington that the fleet could come to the Chesapeake for a limited time. At the same time, a French army under the Comte de Rochambeau had joined Washington's forces near New York. Washington saw the possibility in an instant. If the French fleet could gain control of the Chesapeake and cut Cornwallis off from the sea, and if the combined American and French armies could march south quickly enough to trap him against the coast, Cornwallis and his entire army might be caught and destroyed. The execution of this plan required everything to come together across hundreds of miles by land and sea, with timing that left almost no margin for error. Washington and Rochambeau marched their combined armies south from the New York area with remarkable speed and secrecy, deceiving the British commander in New York into thinking they meant to attack him there, so that he did not move to interfere or to reinforce Cornwallis until it was too late. The march covered a great distance in a short time, the Allied armies hurrying south toward Virginia and the trap they were setting. Meanwhile, the French fleet sailed for the Chesapeake, and when a British fleet arrived to challenge it and to relieve Cornwallis, the two fleets fought a battle in the waters off the Virginia Capes. The French held the field, or rather the sea, and the British fleet, unable to break through, withdrew. With that, the door slammed shut. Cornwallis was cut off from the sea. The British Navy could no longer supply him, reinforce him, or take him off. He was trapped. The combined American and French armies converged on Yorktown and laid siege to it, and the siege that followed was a methodical, professional, and overwhelming operation conducted according to the formal art of besieging a fortified position. The Allies dug their lines of trenches, working closer and closer to the British defenses, and brought up their heavy artillery, including the powerful French siege guns, and began a relentless bombardment of the British position. Day and night, The Allied guns pounded Yorktown, the bombardment growing heavier as the siege lines crept nearer, the British defences being battered to pieces, and the trapped army suffering steadily under the unceasing fire. The Allies stormed key British strongpoints in night assaults, tightening the ring, bringing their guns ever closer, until the British position became untenable. There was no relief coming, no fleet to take them off, no army marching to break the siege. Cornwallis was running out of men, out of supplies, out of options, and out of hope. Cornwallis made a desperate attempt to escape, trying to ferry his army across the river by night to break out, but a sudden storm scattered the boats and foiled the attempt, and the trapped army was thrown back into its battered lines. With his defences crumbling under the bombardment, his men exhausted and dying, no prospect of relief, and no way out, Cornwallis recognized that his situation was hopeless. To continue would be to sacrifice his army to no purpose. In October of 1781, he asked for terms, and then he surrendered his entire army to the combined American and French forces. Thousands of British and German soldiers marched out to lay down their arms before the victorious Allies, the British Army handing over its weapons as the long lines of American and French troops looked on. By tradition, the British were said to have had their musicians play a tune as they marched out to surrender, a melody whose title spoke of a world turned upside down, which, true or not, captured the moment exactly, for a world had indeed been overturned that day. The surrender at Yorktown did not formally end the war, and there would be more skirmishing and negotiation before peace was settled, but everyone understood that something decisive had happened. The capture of a second entire British army, coming on top of years of inconclusive struggle, broke the will of the British government and the British public to continue the war. The cost had become too high, the prospect of victory too remote, the conflict too entangled with the wider war against France and her allies. When the news of Yorktown reached London, the Prime Minister is said to have received it as one receives a mortal blow, crying out that all was over. He was right. The British will to continue the fight in America collapsed. There would be no more great campaigns to subdue the colonies. The war that had begun on a village green in Massachusetts had been won, against all the odds, on a peninsula in Virginia, and the United States had made good on the battlefield the independence it had declared 5 years before. What remained was to secure that independence in the chambers of diplomacy, to turn the victory of arms into a recognized peace, a peace signed in Paris. Effectively decided the war, but turning a battlefield victory into a lasting peace required a long and delicate process of negotiation, and it fell to a remarkable team of American diplomats to secure the best possible terms from a tangled international situation. The war had become a global conflict, with Britain fighting not only the Americans but also France, Spain, and the Dutch, each with its own interests and ambitions, and the peace that ended it would have to satisfy or at least balance the competing demands of all these powers. The Americans, the newest and weakest of the parties, had to navigate this complicated diplomacy with skill if they were to emerge with their independence secured and their interests protected, rather than being sacrificed to the bargaining of the great powers. The American negotiators in Paris were an extraordinary group, led by the aged and famous Benjamin Franklin, whose charm, reputation, and shrewd understanding of European politics made him perhaps the most effective diplomat of his age, joined by John Adams, blunt, principled, and tireless, and John Jay, sharp and suspicious, who together formed a team of complementary talents. They faced a difficult task. They were formally allied with France, and they were supposed to coordinate their negotiations with their French ally. But the Americans came to suspect, with some reason, that French interests and American interests did not perfectly align, and that France, while glad to see Britain humbled, might not want the new United States to emerge too strong or too large, lest it become a power in its own right rather than a grateful client of France. The American negotiators made a bold and somewhat risky decision to negotiate directly with the British, pursuing American interests vigorously, even where this meant getting ahead of their French ally. The terms the Americans secured were remarkably favorable, far better than the new nation's military situation alone might have warranted, a tribute to the skill of the negotiators and to Britain's desire, now that the war was lost, to detach the Americans from France and perhaps lay the groundwork for future good relations and trade. In the treaty signed in Paris in 1783, Britain recognized the independence of the United States formally and completely, acknowledging the new nation's existence and its freedom. This was the great prize, the thing the whole war had been fought for, and it was now secured in writing by the very power that had spent 8 years trying to prevent it. The treaty did more than recognize independence. It granted the United States a vast territory, generous boundaries that extended the new nation westward all the way to the Mississippi River, giving the young country room to grow that would shape its entire future. This was an enormous concession, and it reflected both the strength of the American negotiating position and Britain's calculation that a larger independent United States, friendly and trading with Britain, might serve British interests better than a small, weak one tied to France. The treaty also addressed fishing rights off the coasts of Canada, which mattered greatly to New England, and dealt with questions of debts and the treatment of loyalists, though these latter provisions would prove troublesome and imperfectly honored in the years that followed. For the Loyalists, those colonists who had remained faithful to the Crown throughout the war, the peace brought no comfort, and often great hardship. They had bet on the losing side, and now they paid for it. Many thousands of them, unable or unwilling to live in the new nation, became refugees, abandoning their homes and property and fleeing to Canada, to Britain, or to other parts of the empire, beginning their lives over in exile. The revolution for them was not a glorious birth of liberty, but a catastrophe, the loss of country and property and place. It is worth remembering that the revolution, like all revolutions, produced losers as well as winners, and that the new nation was born in part through the dispossession and exile of a substantial part of its own former population. People whose only crime, in many cases, was loyalty to the government under which they had been born. With the Treaty of Paris, the United States took its place, at least formally, among the independent nations of the world. The transformation was extraordinary to contemplate. A collection of 13 quarrelsome colonies scattered along the edge of a continent, accustomed to thinking of themselves as British subjects, had risen against the greatest empire of the age, fought it for 8 long years, and won not only their independence but recognition and a vast territory in which to build a future. The achievement astonished the world, and it astonished many of the Americans themselves. They had done something that had seemed impossible when it began, something that defied the ordinary odds of history, in which great empires do not usually lose to rebellious provinces. The improbability of it would shape the new nation's sense of itself for generations, the conviction that it was a special and providential undertaking, born against the odds for some great purpose. But independence once won raised a question as difficult in its way as the war itself, and the answer to it was far from clear. The 13 states had united to fight a common enemy, but they remained in many ways 13 separate and jealous sovereignties, bound together loosely and uneasily, suspicious of central authority after a long struggle against exactly that. Having thrown off the rule of a distant king, they were deeply reluctant to submit to any strong government of their own. The arrangement that bound the states together during the war was weak by design, and with the common enemy gone, the weaknesses began to show. The Americans had won their independence. Now they faced the harder and less glorious task of building a nation that could survive, and the story of how they did it, and of all that was left unfinished, is the final chapter of our long journey tonight. When the war ended and the soldiers went home, the United States faced a challenge that was in its way as daunting as the war itself, though far less dramatic. The 13 states had won their independence, but they had not yet become a nation in any settled sense. They were joined together under a loose arrangement drafted during the war that created only the feeblest of central governments, a Congress with little real power, no authority to tax, no ability to regulate trade among the states or with foreign nations, no executive to carry out its decisions, no national courts to settle disputes. This arrangement reflected the deep suspicion of central authority that the long struggle against a distant king had instilled. Having fought a war against a powerful government that taxed and ruled them from afar, the Americans were in no hurry to create a powerful government of their own. But the years after the war revealed the dangers of a government too weak to govern. The central authority could not pay its debts, could not raise revenue, could not compel the states to cooperate, could not present a united face to the world or command respect abroad. The states quarreled among themselves over trade and boundaries and money. Economic troubles bred unrest, and in one alarming episode, debt-ridden farmers in Massachusetts rose in armed rebellion, frightening men of property across the country and dramatizing the apparent inability of the feeble government to maintain order. To many of the leading men of the Revolution, it began to seem that the independence they had won was in danger of dissolving into disorder, that the nation they had created might fall apart from sheer weakness, and that the glorious experiment might end in failure, not at the hands of any foreign enemy, but through its own internal frailty. Out of this anxiety came one of the most consequential gatherings in human history. In the summer of 1787, delegates from the states met in Philadelphia, in the same city where independence had been declared 11 years before, ostensibly to revise the weak arrangement that bound the states together. Instead, behind closed doors and in great secrecy, they undertook something far more ambitious. They wrote an entirely new framework of government, the Constitution of the United States, creating a federal government far stronger than what had come before, with the power to tax, to regulate commerce, to raise armies, to conduct foreign relations, and to act directly upon the people rather than merely upon the states. They divided this government into branches designed to check and balance one another, a legislature, an executive, and a judiciary, each restraining the others, an ingenious mechanism intended to create a government strong enough to govern, but structured so as to prevent any one part of it from gathering too much power and sliding into the tyranny they had just fought a war to escape. The making of the Constitution was an act of compromise as much as a vision, and some of the compromises were dark ones. The deepest and most shameful concerned slavery, which the framers, unable or unwilling to abolish, instead accommodated and protected in the new framework, postponing a reckoning that would eventually come at the cost of a far bloodier war than the Revolution itself. The great contradiction that had been present from the very beginning, the nation conceived in a declaration that all men are created equal, yet built in part upon the bondage of hundreds of thousands of people, was carried forward into the Constitution, unresolved, a wound at the heart of the new republic that would fester for generations. The Revolution had proclaimed a magnificent ideal and had fallen far short of living up to it, and the gap between the promise and the reality would drive much of the nation's later history, as group after group laid claim to the promise of equality that the founders had proclaimed but not fulfilled. For the ideal, once set loose in the world, could not be confined to the narrow meaning its authors may have intended. When Jefferson wrote that all men are created equal, he and the other founders were thinking, in practice, of a fairly narrow circle, free men of property and standing, much like themselves. But the words they used were universal, and universal words have a way of escaping the control of those who write them. In the decades and centuries that followed, people whom the founders had not meant to include, the enslaved, the poor, the women, the excluded of every kind, would seize upon those words and turn them into a demand, holding the nation to the full meaning of its own founding promise. The history of the United States since the Revolution can be read in large part as the long, halting, incomplete struggle to make the reality of the country match the ideal proclaimed at its birth. That struggle is not finished even now. The Revolution's influence reached far beyond the borders of the new nation. The example of a people throwing off monarchy and establishing a republic founded on the consent of the governed sent a tremor through the established order of the world. Within a few years, France would have its own revolution, far bloodier and more chaotic, drawing inspiration in part from the American example. And the ideas unleashed in America of liberty, of equality, of government by consent, of the right of a people to determine their own fate, would spread across the globe in the centuries to come, inspiring revolutions and reforms and the slow, uneven advance of self-government in nation after nation. The American Revolution was a local event, a quarrel between a group of colonies and their mother country over taxes and rights. But it became something far larger, a demonstration that the old order of kings and subjects was not eternal, that people could govern themselves, that a nation could be founded on an idea. And so we come to the end of our long journey from a tense night on a Massachusetts green to the framing of a new government in Philadelphia by way of massacre and tea, of declaration and defeat, of icy rivers and frozen camps, of Saratoga and Yorktown. What began as a dispute over a few pennies of tax became a war for independence. And what began as a war for independence became the founding of a nation built, however imperfectly, on the radical idea that governments exist to serve the governed, and that all people are created equal. The men and women who lived through it were ordinary people caught up in extraordinary events, frightened and uncertain, often divided, rarely sure of what they were doing or where it would lead. They did not know they were making history. They were simply trying to navigate a crisis that had come upon them. And in doing so, they built something that would outlast them all and reshape the world. The Revolution left behind a nation, a constitution, an ideal, and a contradiction. And it left behind a promise still waiting to be fully kept. Its story is not a simple tale of heroes and triumph, but something richer and more human. A tale of courage and cruelty, of vision and blindness, of soaring ideals and bitter compromises, of ordinary people who did something that astonished the world and left it changed. That is perhaps the truest thing that can be said of it, and a fitting thought to carry with you now into sleep. The night has grown deep, and our long story has reached its quiet close. Let the names and dates settle gently behind you now. The green at Lexington, the crossing of the river, the winter camp, the surrender at Yorktown. All of it drifting softly out of focus, like a landscape seen from a slowing train. There is nothing more you need to hold on to tonight. If you are still awake, there is another journey waiting for you on the screen whenever you wish to take it. And if you enjoyed this one, you are warmly welcome to like and subscribe, or to leave a thought below in the comments. But for now, let all of that go. Let your breathing slow. Let your body grow heavy and still. Close your eyes and let yourself rest. Good night and sweet dreams.